All right, I am here with Ben. Ben, thank you so much for joining me on this call.
Of course, no problem. I'm Benjamin Kiefer, also known as BenStar on the internet. I'm the lead developer behind the Roguelite game REVITA.
Awesome. Thank you for joining me. I got a few questions for you, and you can feel free to answer however you want. No pressure at all. And let's just get started.
That's good.
I like the game REVITA. I played it quite a bit. And when I play a lot of these games, I tend to like comparing them or thinking about how what were inspirations to the developers when they were developing it. So as I was playing this game, I felt some inspirations from in other games like Hades, Gungeon with their meta progression, but also a bit of Celeste and its overall like story and even the art. What games did you have as inspiration while making REVITA?
A good question. The games that have inspired me the most are probably other roguelites. So yeah, as you said, like your Dead Cells, Enter the Gungeon. There's a lot of Binding of Isaac in there, since that's the game that got me into roguelites. But there's also like a bunch of other things, as you said, like Celeste played a big influence, not necessarily in the art, but like the way the platforming works, in regards to like accessibility, that kind of stuff. Like there's a lot of Hollow Knight in there, just for the overall atmosphere. The whole regenerating health is very heavily referenced from Hollow Knight. So yeah, there's a lot of games.
Yeah, effectively, I could feel there are just so many combinations of little things from here and there. I always think that games that roguelikes that I find are most engaging and keep me going are ones where there's also some kind of difficulty meter you can put yourself, and having to find like a nice way to make difficulties more interesting through different runs without just simply doing more health, more attack speed and stuff like that can be challenging but also really interesting. And I love the way that you made shards in this game, where every 5 shards almost like a drastic different like new gameplay mechanic is introduced that the player has to adjust to. And actually, yeah, so when I was thinking of when I was playing, and I saw definitely the references from Celeste in the platforming and all, but I was also wondering in terms of the plot. I always find roguelikes to struggle having an engaging story or plot, as most of them tend to be more on the ridiculous or even goofy side.
Right.
What pushed you to make REVITA's story what it is?
That's also a very good question. In general, like personally, I have a very big interest in like very heavy, emotional, like very melancholic storytelling, I guess. Funnily enough, one of the keywords during the development of REVITA was just the word melancholy as the way to describe the game, and like in its artistic aspects, as you said, the story, that kind of stuff. Just a lot of like, I wanted to kind of like tell a story that has like a message and a meaning behind it. That's not just like, oh, like we just needed a reason for you to get to the end of this. Like I wanted to actually, say something with the game.
Yeah, and I really respect it, because I do think that can be quite challenging for little indie games to get serious or like, almost emotional. So I thought that was a really, really nice touch while playing the game, because it did push me to want to see what was going to happen with the story, read the notes that can be really tricky to get to, and they're very rewarding as a nice plot device to understand what's going on in the game. So massive props on that. You briefly mentioned when you last came by on stream that there were a lot of choices you made in the design side of things that you regret in hindsight. Not the best business move for some of them, you noted. I'm curious if you could elaborate more on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few kind of like aspects to the game that personally I'm not unhappy with, but from a business side might have not been the smartest things to do. The big idea behind REVITA was to take the idea of risk versus reward, which is like kind of like the driving force of every roguelite, and kind of see how far that could be pushed to create like very interesting player agency. But the issue then that brings with it is that it makes it very hard to get into, but also on the other side, if you get too good at the game, it comes to a certain point where it starts potentially becoming irrelevant, because that risk changes depending on player skill. So you don't have like a kind of like equal experience no matter where you are in your progression as a player. And then the other big point is the control scheme. I personally really like the control scheme. I think it's the perfect control scheme for this kind of game. Basically having the jump button on one of the back buttons, allowing you to have full control over your aiming. But obviously it's not a traditional kind of like you jump on the A button control scheme, and then makes it on top of the general like punishing gameplay mechanics very early on in the game. That on top of that, trying to also figure out how to control the game makes it not very entry new player friendly.
Yeah, I completely agree, but I also I'm such a fan of effectively the movement and the controls. I definitely want to I wanted to elaborate personally, at least on my video, talking about the propelling effect from shooting under you. Has so much like skill involved, and you don't even think about it for the first few hours of the game, since you're just focused on just understanding basic mechanics. But later on, it really shows that someone who has a lot of skill and mastery of the game can really benefit from understanding these little nuances that a new player might not see, and really reward the players that get very comfortable with the core controls of the game. And actually, speaking of that side of development, were you always planning on making a twin-stick shooter dungeon crawler kind of game? And if so, was the idea of health being a resource there from the start?
The plan was always the original plan was to always make a 2D platformer roguelite. That was kind of the original idea. That was went into the development of it. However, the whole health mechanic and all that came way later. So, realistically speaking, this project has been in development for around 6 to 7 years, but pretty much the first half of that was just me experimenting around with a lot of ideas. Like, the game was originally not even called REVITA, it was called Aerodynamic, and the whole gimmick about it was that you had a bow and arrow, and so the whole shtick of it was, hey, how do I have to shoot my arrows so that gravity affects it in a way where I can hit my enemies, that kind of stuff. But then as I kept developing, as I kept, also improving my craft, the game changed quite a lot. Suddenly it was like all about like, oh, you have like a sword, and it's like kind of like more beat 'em up-esque. And that's also when the procedural room generation came in. And then later on, obviously, at some point, it got to the point where I settled with the HP mechanic, because I thought that could be an interesting foundational mechanic that can be integrated in pretty much every aspect of the game, and therefore create like a very unique and interesting experience.
Awesome. So I've always found level designs to be a really interesting topic when dealing with roguelikes and roguelites. Something that I honestly think people don't talk enough about. Since with the nature of the repetition design from these games, I think it creates something really complicated and unique. And in the public beta of REVITA, you decided to expand quite a bit on the level design. I was wondering what pushed you to do so.
So one of the biggest challenges in developing the game, not just programmatical challenges, but also just personal challenges, was the level design. I'm personally not a level designer. I don't like designing levels. So one of the things that I early on decided, because I looked at other roguelites and I was just like, oh, a lot of roguelites, especially like smaller ones that don't have like the kind of like budget or availability of like games like Enter the Gungeon or Isaac, where the developers on that have a lot more time to fine-tune their levels, make just a lot of levels. I decided to try to figure out a way to procedurally generate all the levels. And so then over multiple months, I came up with a system that I was quite happy with, that then made it into the public version. The only issue with that is that, generally speaking, the way that system was designed, it made for very rectangular rooms, where the biggest difference were just like, oh, like sometimes a place is a platform here, sometimes a place is a platform there. And so with the beta and the 2.0 in general, that was one of the things I wanted to expand on. Just making sure that, like, no, it's not just like rectangles. Like, there are also like other kind of like layouts that the procedural generation can build upon to expand like the variety of level design, and also obviously the combat encounters exponentially.
Awesome. Yeah. I didn't think of the rectangle thing when you talked about it, but I can clearly see that now there's a lot more movement involved, and I actually feel like while I was playing the beta, I was getting more comfortable with the controls because it was forcing me to move a lot more and adjust to the level design of each room much more than the one in the current version. So I find that really interesting.
Yeah, also one more aspect of it was that one thing that I noticed very early on into the early access was that people, instead of engaging with the rooms, they just stood in a corner and they just waited for enemies to approach them, which would technically be the safest way to approach a room. But it also made it so a lot of people ran into situations where they then got cornered by enemies, which then made the encounters feel very unfair on the player side, but also made it so there wasn't really a lot of movement or interesting mobility gameplay involved. So that was also kind of a way to also combat that aspect.
I can imagine. Were you worried about people potentially not being thrilled with the fact that from there on rooms would take longer? Yes.
That was one of the reasons that we even wanted to do a beta for the 2.0, was that there were a lot of changes in the beta that changed the game quite drastically, like in the way the game flows, in the way you play the game, the way you approach the game. And so I wanted to make sure that before I put that in like a public version, there would be a way for the community to test this and make sure that, like a majority of the people at the very least would be happy with those changes.
Makes sense. A simple one for you, but I'm quite curious. Do you recall what was the most challenging part for you to design while developing REVITA?
So not program design specifically.
Yeah.
I mean, probably the whole health management aspect. Just not necessarily because conceptually it's very complicated, but because it basically, whenever anything in the game changes, you also then need to adjust the economy to make sure that everything still is balanced. And because of the way health is not just, it's like there's one specific way in which you can spend health to get a thing. No, it's like everything. Like everything resolves around that system. So then if you just tweak like a tiny thing, that then has like kind of like a snowball effect on everything else. So you always need to kind of like keep everything in mind and see like, oh, okay, so if I change this, let's look at everything else and see what else needs to be changed to make up for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anything else you want to add before we close out this interview?
Nothing in particular.
Cool. Well, yeah, that's all I wanted to ask for the video. So I really, really appreciate you answering these questions. This was really interesting to me, and I look forward to plugging it in with everything else to make a really interesting video on the design of REVITA.
Heck yeah.
Thanks a lot, Ben.
No problem.